The quiet suburban streets of Charlotte, North Carolina, basked in the golden glow of a setting sun as Julian Coleman, a calm, composed 48-year-old man, made his way home. His modest black sedan blended into the neighborhood, but his thoughts were fixed on the comforting aroma of his wife's famous pot roast awaiting him. It was an ordinary evening, or so it seemed. Suddenly, red and blue lights shattered the calm. A patrol car sped behind him, its siren screaming. Julian's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He glanced at his speedometer. 29 in a 35 zone. No broken tail lights, no violations. Still, he pulled over, his experience reminding him to stay calm, hands visible, movements deliberate. As the officer's flashlight pierced the car's dim interior, Julian's measured composure clashed with the hostility emanating from the two officers. Accusations flew: reckless driving, swerving lanes. Julian's polite explanations only escalated their aggression. In moments, the situation spiraled. Handcuffs snapped onto his wrists and he was shoved into the back of the squad car. The officers thought they'd apprehended another easy target. What they didn't realize was that the man in their custody was no ordinary citizen. Julian Coleman was their new police chief, determined to expose the system's flaws from within. As the night unfolds, the officers' reckless actions will lead to consequences they never expected, and Julian's quiet strength will ignite a fight for justice far beyond that precinct. You've witnessed the beginning of a story about courage, accountability, and the pursuit of justice. If you believe these values are worth fighting for, hit like, subscribe, and comment "Justice Matters" to support this powerful journey. The patrol car rolled through the suburban streets, its interior tense with the casual banter of two officers oblivious to the storm they had just set in motion. Julian Coleman sat stiffly in the backseat, his wrists marked from the cold handcuffs that had been slapped on him moments ago. His composed demeanor remained unshaken, but his mind worked furiously. Every detail, every word exchanged, was stored carefully, a quiet calculation for what lay ahead. Officer Daniels, the younger of the two, glanced back at Julian through the rearview mirror, his smirk brimming with arrogance. "What's your story, huh? Late night drug run? Or just out for trouble?" Julian met his gaze steadily, his voice calm but resolute. "I'm just a man trying to get home." Beside Daniels, Officer Reed, a stockier man with an air of smug indifference, chuckled. "Yeah, we hear that all the time." The weight of their profiling sat heavily in the air, but Julian remained silent. He knew better than to engage now. His patience, however, was not born of fear. It was the quiet resolve of a man who understood that justice would eventually prevail. When they arrived at the precinct, Julian was led to a cold, fluorescent-lit holding cell. Daniels removed the cuffs with an exaggerated flourish, mocking Julian with a false politeness. "Welcome to your new home for the night. Don't get too comfortable." "Am I being charged?" Julian asked evenly, rubbing his wrists. Reed leaned against the desk, smirking. "We'll let you know when we figure that out. Sit tight." The metal door clanged shut, echoing through the precinct. Julian sat on the hard bench, his hands clasped and posture steady. Outside the cell, the two officers laughed quietly, reviewing his license and car registration. "Nothing out of the ordinary," Daniels muttered, sounding disappointed. Reed shrugged. "Doesn't matter. Guys like him always have skeletons. We'll dig something up." Julian heard every word, his expression unreadable. He didn't flinch, didn't react. Instead, he remained still, calculating his next move. Hours passed as the precinct buzzed with activity, officers passing by occasionally glancing at him with curiosity. None seemed to recognize him, and that suited him just fine. As dawn began to creep through the precinct windows, footsteps approached the cell. Lieutenant Morgan, a stern and no-nonsense officer, appeared before him. Her badge gleamed under the fluorescent light as she scanned the paperwork in her hand, her sharp gaze darting from Julian to the two officers. "Why is this man in custody?" she asked, her tone clipped but professional. Daniels stepped forward. "Reckless driving and resisting arrest, ma'am." Morgan's brow furrowed. "Where's the evidence?" Reed spoke casually. "We haven't processed it yet." Morgan's eyes narrowed. "Get it now." "Daniels, in my office." Her words cut through the tension like a knife, and the two officers exchanged nervous glances before scrambling to comply. Julian, observing quietly, felt the tide begin to shift. Morgan turned back to Julian, her gaze steady. "I'm reviewing your case. Sit tight." Julian gave her a calm nod, knowing that patience would soon reveal the truth. If you've stayed with us so far, let us know your thoughts in the comments. Would you remain as composed as Julian in this situation? The precinct bustled as Officer Daniels and Reed begrudgingly began reviewing Julian's dashcam footage in a side room. Julian remained seated in his cell, his calm exterior masking the swirling thoughts within. He knew he didn't belong there, and he also knew that the very system he now sat in was about to face its reckoning. Lieutenant Morgan reappeared, holding a tablet in her hand. She stood in front of Julian's cell, her stern expression softening slightly as she gestured for him to approach. "We reviewed your dashcam footage," she said, her tone sharp but professional. "The footage contradicts the arresting officer's report entirely. You're being released immediately." Julian raised an eyebrow, his voice calm but pointed. "I appreciate your diligence, Lieutenant. What happens to them now?" Morgan hesitated, glancing back at the holding area where Daniels and Reed were avoiding her gaze. "There will be an investigation," she replied, "but I'd like to discuss next steps privately." Minutes later, Julian found himself seated across from Morgan in her office. The room was bare but orderly, a reflection of her no-nonsense approach to leadership. She folded her hands on the desk, her gaze fixed on him. "Sir," she began, "I couldn't help but notice your composure throughout all of this. Most people wouldn't be as calm in your situation. Who are you really?" Julian allowed a small, measured smile. "Let's just say I've been in situations like this before," he replied. "Calmness often reveals the truth better than anger." Morgan studied him, clearly intrigued, but chose not to press further. Instead, she leaned back in her chair. The actions of those officers were unacceptable. "Rest assured, this isn't over. I'll make sure it's addressed." Julian nodded, appreciating her resolve. "Thank you, Lieutenant. It's not just about me. This is about ensuring it doesn't happen to anyone else." As Julian exited the precinct, the morning sun greeted him, warming his face as if in contrast to the cold events of the night before. But instead of heading home, he drove straight to his office at the police headquarters he now oversaw. His assistant, Anita, looked up in surprise as he walked in. "Chief Coleman," she stammered, "you're here early." Julian gave her a slight nod. "Prepare a briefing room for me," he instructed, his tone steady but firm. "I need to address the department this afternoon." Anita hesitated for a moment, sensing the gravity in his voice, before nodding and getting to work. As Julian closed the door to his office, he took a deep breath. He knew this wasn't just about setting the record straight. This was about confronting a culture of injustice that had persisted for far too long. What would you do in Julian's position? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe to see how Julian's fight for accountability unfolds. By early afternoon, the precinct was filled with tension as officers gathered in the briefing room. curious about the sudden meeting called by their new police chief. Julian Coleman stood at the front, his commanding presence silencing the room as he surveyed the faces before him. Some looked indifferent, others anxious. Among them were officers Daniels and Reed, seated near the back with stiff postures and forced composure. Julian began, his voice calm yet unwavering. What happened last night wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a larger problem within this department, a problem I've been tasked to fix. The room remained silent, his words cutting through any lingering sense of denial. Julian's gaze swept over his audience before continuing. We're here to serve and protect, not to profile, harass, or intimidate. If anyone in this room doesn't believe in that mission, this is not the place for you. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, while Reed clenched his jaw, his defiance evident. Julian, however, didn't flinch. He laid out a series of reforms he planned to implement: mandatory bias training, stricter oversight, and an anonymous reporting system for misconduct. The room seemed to tense further at the mention of accountability, but Julian pressed on. I didn't take this position to maintain the status quo, he said firmly. I took it to create real change. And change starts now. The meeting concluded with mixed reactions. Some officers left quietly, contemplating the chief's words, while others exchanged skeptical glances. Daniels and Reed were among the latter, their expressions dark as they exited the room. Later that evening, Julian returned home, where his wife, Grace, greeted him at the door. Long day, she asked, her tone light but concerned. Julian nodded, loosening his tie. Longer than most, he admitted, sitting down at the dining table. Grace placed a plate of her signature pot roast in front of him, her reassuring smile grounding him after the day's events. As they ate, Julian's phone buzzed with a notification. A local news outlet had picked up the story, and the dash cam footage was now circulating online. Public outrage was growing, with calls for an independent investigation into the department's practices. Julian set his phone down, his resolve hardening. This is just the beginning, he said quietly, more to himself than to Grace. She reached out, placing a hand on his. Whatever happens, you're doing the right thing, she said softly. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, the fallout was already beginning. Daniels and Reed found themselves under intense scrutiny, their actions sparking internal discussions that rippled through the department. The reckoning Julian had promised was underway. If you believe in accountability and the power of standing up for what's right, comment justice for all. Together, we can demand the change we want to see. The courtroom was packed the next morning, buzzing with anticipation as the case of Julian Coleman versus officers Daniels and Reed reached its critical stage. The atmosphere was electric, with local reporters lining the courthouse steps, eager for updates. Inside, the tension was palpable as Julian sat at the defense table, his lawyer Sandra Reyes flipping through documents with practiced precision. Across the room, Daniels and Reed sat stiffly, their unease clear despite their efforts to mask it. The judge entered, calling the session to order. The prosecution presented its opening remarks, reiterating the original charges of reckless driving and resisting arrest. But Sandra was ready. When it was her turn, Sandra stood confidently, addressing the jury with a commanding presence. Your Honor, these charges are not only baseless, but represent a clear abuse of power fueled by bias. Today, we'll prove just that. She played the dash cam footage for the court, the screen showing Julian driving steadily, his speed consistent. Next came the body cam footage, exposing Daniel's muttered remarks and Reed's dismissive laughter. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as the officer's unprofessionalism was laid bare. Sandra paused the video and turned to the jury. This is not just a mistake. This is a pattern. One that endangers the very people these officers are sworn to protect. The prosecutor's argument unraveled as the footage contradicted their claims. Even the judge seemed displeased, his sharp gaze falling on Daniels and Reed. Sandra turned to Julian, giving him a small nod. It was time. Julian stood, adjusting his tie. He addressed the court calmly, but with conviction. My name is Julian Coleman, and I am the chief of police for the city. I chose not to disclose my position earlier because I wanted the truth to reveal itself without interference. The room erupted into murmurs. Daniel's face turned pale, and Reed's composure faltered. The judge banged his gavel for silence as Julian continued. This case isn't just about me. It's about holding those who misuse their authority accountable. That's a responsibility I take seriously. When Julian finished speaking, the courtroom buzzed with tension. The judge called for a recess, allowing everyone to process what had just been revealed. Outside, reporters swarmed, microphones thrust forward as Julian exited the courthouse. He raised a hand, silencing the crowd. This case represents a broader issue within our systems. Accountability and integrity must guide law enforcement. I'm committed to ensuring that moving forward, the fallout was swift. Daniels and Reed were suspended pending an investigation, and public outrage grew as the footage spread online. Protests emerged, demanding reform and justice. For Julian, the work was only beginning, but the first step had been taken. Let this story remind us of the importance of accountability and standing up for justice. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below. What changes do you believe are necessary for a fairer system? Your voice matters. The sterile atmosphere of the courtroom buzzed with tension. Word about Julian's case had spread, drawing a packed gallery of spectators and reporters. Seated at the defendant's table, Julian adjusted his tie, his calm demeanor unshaken as his lawyer, Sandra Reyes, prepared to dismantle the baseless accusations. Across the room, Daniels and Reed sat stiffly, their confidence waning under the weight of the mounting evidence against them. The prosecutor began with their narrative, outlining the officers' claims of reckless driving and resistance. But when Sandra stood to speak, her commanding voice filled the room. Your Honor, she began, these charges are a direct result of racial profiling, as the evidence will demonstrate. The lights dimmed as the court watched the dashcam footage. It revealed Julian driving within the speed limit, his calm compliance juxtaposed against the officer's hostile demeanor. Gasps rippled through the room when the body cam footage exposed Daniels muttering under his breath. Another one of them causing trouble, followed by Reed's derisive chuckle. The judge's expression hardened as Sandra delivered her final argument. This is not just about one man's rights being violated. It's about the systemic abuse of power that must be addressed. When Julian finally stood, the room fell silent. My name is Julian Coleman, he announced, his voice steady. I am the chief of police for the city. I chose to remain silent during my arrest to allow the truth to speak for itself. What happened to me is emblematic of a deeper issue within our system, and it's time for accountability. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, and the officer's smug expressions dissolved into panic. The judge banged his gavel, restoring order before announcing the dismissal of all charges against Julian. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Julian as he addressed the crowd. This case is a reminder that justice is not guaranteed. It's something we must continually fight for. As chief of police, I am committed to creating a system that serves everyone with integrity at its core. The fallout was swift. Daniels and Reed were suspended pending investigation, and Julian immediately began implementing reforms within his department. He addressed his officers with conviction, emphasizing the need for accountability and fairness. "We are here to serve and protect," he stated, "not to perpetuate fear and injustice. If you cannot uphold these values, this is not the place for you." In the following months, Julian's leadership sparked change within the department. Community trust began to rebuild as new policies, including mandatory bias training and an anonymous reporting system, took effect. During a town hall meeting, a young man stood up and said, "Chief Coleman, what you went through, it could have been any of us. Thank you for standing up for justice." Julian nodded, his resolve unwavering. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he replied, "but together we can build a system that truly serves everyone." Julian's story is a powerful reminder of the importance of accountability and courage. If we want to create a world rooted in justice, we must stand together and demand change. What do you think needs to change in your community to ensure fairness and equality for all? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that inspire action and hope.